When Natalie met Jason, she thought she was living a modern-day fairy tale. He seemed like the ideal man, attentive, kind, a respected professional who knew exactly what to say to make her feel special. Her friends admired him. Her co-workers commented that she had won the lottery by marrying someone like him. The first weeks of their marriage were filled with romantic dinners, weekend getaways, and declarations of love that seemed straight out of a movie. Natalie, orphaned from an early age, saw in Jason not only a husband but also a safe haven, someone who would finally bring stability to her life. But behind the smiles and promises, there was a detail she hadn't yet realized. Jason was incapable of defying his family. This seemingly harmless detail would be the beginning of a slow and painful revelation. Little by little, Natalie began to notice that whenever they were around Jason's parents, his personality changed. The sweet, confident man gave way to someone hesitant, almost submissive, who seemed to dread his father's every word. At first, she tried to ignore it, believing it was simply out of respect or family tradition, but she soon realized the attitude ran much deeper. Jason not only remained silent, but also left her exposed to the family's veiled criticism. At Sunday lunches, his father-in-law would insinuate that Natalie wasn't a good housewife, and Jason would just laugh it off, as if it were a meaningless joke. To Natalie, it sounded like small cracks in a seemingly solid wall. And, as with any structure, an ignored crack sooner or later leads to its inevitable collapse. Natalie still believed that love would be enough to sustain the marriage, but what she didn't know was that she was entering a cycle of manipulation disguised as family tradition. Her father-in-law controlled every family decision, where they would spend their vacations, how they would invest their money, and even how Jason would conduct his own work. Natalie felt like a guest in her own life, someone whose opinion carried no weight. When she tried to talk to her husband about how she felt, Jason would brush it off, telling her she was overreacting or that she needed to be more understanding. This complicit silence began to corrode her heart, because realizing that her partner not only didn't defend her, but also didn't listen to her, was as painful as any direct attack. The marriage of her dreams was beginning to reveal its shadows. The turning point came on a seemingly ordinary evening. Natalie and Jason returned from a family gathering, where once again she had been the target of harsh comments disguised as jokes. When they got home, she decided to open her heart and said, "Jason, I can't live like this anymore, being humiliated in front of everyone." His response was like an invisible punch. "You need to learn to deal with them, Natalie. They're my family, and I won't turn against them." At that moment, the mask slipped. The man she believed to be her protector had chosen his side, the side of submission and convenience, even at the cost of his wife's dignity. What she had thought was love began to reveal itself as cowardice. With a heavy heart, Natalie finally realized what was happening. Her marriage wasn't the fairy tale everyone believed. It was a sham carefully maintained by Jason to please his family and maintain a perfect image in society. The woman who had once dreamed of a future of complicity now realized she was alone, waging a silent war against her husband's indifference and the contempt of her in-laws. But within this pain, a spark of strength also emerged. If Jason wouldn't protect her, she would have to rise up herself. And although she didn't yet know how, deep in her heart, she already understood that this story wouldn't end with her defeated. On the contrary, it would be in this abyss of disappointment that Natalie would find the weapons for her revenge. From the first moment she met Frank, Natalie felt an uneasy feeling she couldn't explain. He had a piercing, cold gaze, the kind that seemed to evaluate and judge every move. At family gatherings, his presence filled the room in a suffocating way, as if everyone were constantly at the mercy of his opinions. Frank spoke loudly, interrupted conversations, and never accepted being contradicted. To him, every word was law, and anyone who dared disagree was made a laughingstock in front of everyone. Natalie tried to be polite, but it didn't take long for her to realize that no matter what she did, he always found a way to belittle her. And the most painful part was seeing Jason, her husband, laugh along as if it were just his father's way of being. Over time, Frank's comments became increasingly cruel. He said Natalie's career was a waste of time, that a woman should dedicate herself entirely to her family. He compared her to other daughters-in-law or acquaintances, always in a derogatory tone. Jason deserved better, he once said in front of everyone, as if it were just a casual observation. It was like a deep cut in Natalie's heart. She felt that with each encounter, her self-esteem was being undermined little by little. She tried to talk to Diane, her mother-in-law, for support, but Diane always responded with the same phrase, "It's just the way he is, don't take it so seriously." The problem was that for Natalie, every word Frank said was like a hammer destroying her self-worth. Frank wasn't just talking. His way of controlling situations was calculated and manipulative. He made a point of keeping everyone dependent on him, whether financially or emotionally. Jason, even as an adult, still sought his father's approval for every important decision. Natalie became increasingly invisible in this scenario, as if she were merely a prop at the wedding. Frank liked to reinforce this by calling her the girl Jason brought instead of using her name. It was a perverse psychological game that made it clear who held the power. With each humiliation, Natalie felt her anger grow, but she still lacked the strength to fight back. It was as if she were trapped in a web carefully woven by her father-in-law, where her every move was watched and belittled. The final straw came at one of the family dinners. Frank made a point of displaying old photos of Jason with an ex-girlfriend, insinuating that he would have been happier with someone else. The silence at the table was broken by Frank's sarcastic laugh as he looked directly at Natalie, expecting to see her pain. And he did. But what he didn't realize was that, by inciting that wound, he also ignited something that could not be extinguished. Natalie began to see Frank not just as an inconvenient father-in-law, but as the true enemy of her peace. There, deep in her soul, a silent promise was born. One day that man would pay for every tear he had caused her. Frank's power was so great that no one in the family dared stand up to him. He kept everyone under control, using fear as his main weapon. But unlike the others, Natalie wasn't willing to bow down forever. If at first she had tried to win his approval, now she felt something else: contempt. The image he had built as a strong, unbeatable patriarch was beginning to crack before her eyes. And although she still suffered in silence, Natalie already understood that everyone's fear of Frank was also his greatest weakness. Because when the time came, she would use that very fear against him. With each new attack from Frank, Natalie hoped deep in her heart that Jason would stand up and defend her, that he would show her that the love he claimed to feel for her was greater than his fear of his father. But each time, Jason remained silent. He would look away, pretend not to hear, or even let out a nervous laugh as if the humiliations were just harmless comments. For Natalie, this omission was as painful as Frank's words, because there was nothing crueler than being invisible to the person sworn to protect her. Her husband's silence wasn't just a lack of voice, it was a conscious choice of loyalty, and in that choice, Jason made it clear, his priority would never be his wife, but his father. Natalie tried to find justifications for this behavior. She thought perhaps Jason was afraid of losing the inheritance, or that he was so accustomed to Frank's dominance that he no longer knew how to live outside his shadow. But none of these excuses eased the pain. She remembered the promises made at the altar, the vows of support, and wondered, where were they now? Jason's silence echoed louder than any word Frank had spoken, and the longer he remained silent, the more Natalie realized she was alone in this marriage. The man she believed to be a life partner was, in practice, an accomplice to oppression. There were times when Natalie considered confronting him, asking him to choose between her and her father. But whenever she opened her mouth to start a conversation, Jason changed the subject, avoided eye contact, and said he didn't want unnecessary drama. This phrase, repeated over and over, became a sharp blade that cut deep. To him, everything Natalie felt was just an exaggeration. Her pain wasn't valid, the humiliation wasn't real, and his silence was the only way forward. This disregard not only hurt her, but also sparked a silent rage that grew with each night she cried alone, hiding her tears in her pillow. Jason's silence wasn't limited to family gatherings. In everyday life, when Natalie tried to express her feelings, he silenced her as well. He'd say things like, "You complicate things too much," or "We don't have to make a problem out of everything." He didn't realize, or perhaps didn't want to realize, that by not acknowledging her pain, he was becoming part of the abuse. Natalie began to feel like she didn't have a husband, but a stranger in her home. A stranger who, instead of offering protection, only omission. His silence was the loudest cry of betrayal she'd ever heard. Over time, Natalie stopped expecting Jason to defend her. The void he left with his voicelessness was filled with a bitter certainty. She could never count on him. This realization, though painful, was liberating, because upon realizing she was alone, Natalie also realized she no longer needed to rely on anyone but her own strength. Her husband's complicit silence was the spark that lit her flame of independence. If Jason preferred to be shadow, she would choose to be light. And when the moment was right, she would use his silence as irrefutable proof of her cowardice before everyone. It was his in-laws' wedding anniversary, and Frank's house was packed with relatives, friends, and acquaintances. The ambiance oozed with luxury, crystal glasses lined, china plates gleaming, and a table laden with expensive food that reflected Frank's status and pride. To Natalie, every detail seemed calculated to reaffirm the family's power. She was accustomed to the teasing, but that night something in the air felt heavier. Frank watched her critically, waiting for the slightest slip-up to turn into a spectacle. Jason, as always, stood by his father's side, smiling at the guests and pretending everything was in perfect harmony. Natalie breathed deeply, trying to hold herself together, but deep down she knew this dinner would change everything. The moment the wine was served, tension mounted. Natalie was holding her glass when, in an unpretentious gesture, she spilled a few drops onto the white tablecloth. A simple accident, common at any dinner party, but for Frank it was the perfect trigger. He slammed his hand on the table, making the glasses clink, and glared at her. "Can't you do anything right, Natalie?" he said loudly, for everyone to hear. The silence that followed was suffocating. All eyes turned to her, waiting for her reaction, while Natalie's heart raced, filled with a mixture of anger and shame. Before she could respond, Frank stood up and, in an act of pure contempt, forcefully pushed her hand away, spilling the remaining wine onto her dress. The stifled laughter of some guests echoed like razors. Natalie felt her skin burn, not from the wine, but from the public humiliation. Physical aggression was a limit she never imagined her father-in-law would cross, and once again, when she instinctively sought Jason's eyes, she found only silence. He looked away, unable to face reality. That night seared into Natalie's heart the certainty that she was not only facing an oppressive father-in-law, but also a complicit husband. The feeling of being alone in front of everyone was suffocating. Natalie tried to compose herself, but her wet dress and the scornful looks crushed her. Some guests whispered, others pretended not to see, but no one rose to her defense. Her loneliness was absolute. Frank, satisfied, sat back down, as if he had won another invisible battle. The powerful gesture was complete. He had shown in front of everyone that she had no voice, no place in this family. His sarcastic smile was more painful than the shove, and Jason, motionless, confirmed the silent betrayal that gnawed at Natalie's heart. But amidst the suppressed tears and the bitter taste of humiliation, something shifted within her. That pain, that public shame, was the final flame that ignited her soul. The dinner of humiliation, which should have destroyed her, was actually the stage where her definitive decision was born. She would never again remain silent. Frank thought he had won, but in reality, he had just created her greatest enemy. In that moment, Natalie swore to herself that this man would pay for every drop of wine, every cruel word, and every laugh that echoed at her expense. What he didn't know was that her revenge was already beginning to be written there, silently, in front of everyone. That same night, when everyone had already left, Natalie believed she would finally have a moment of comfort from her husband. She hoped that Jason, out of the family's sight, would be able to see the gravity of what had happened. Her heart still ached, the shame still burned on her skin, but there was a glimmer of hope within her that he, at least in private, would take her side. But what she received was the cruelest sentence of her entire life. Jason, instead of hugging her, stared at her coldly and said, "Natalie, you need to apologize to my father. He was just angry, and you overreacted." Those words felt like shards of glass piercing her chest. Natalie couldn't believe what she was hearing. Apologizing to the man who had assaulted and humiliated her in front of everyone, her entire body trembled with indignation. She tried to argue, saying that Frank had crossed all lines, but Jason remained unmoved, repeating that she should apologize if she wanted to maintain peace in the family. This wasn't just cowardice, it was betrayal. It confirmed that Jason would never be her ally. To him, the love she claimed to feel was worthless, compared to the weight of his father's approval. Natalie realized she had lost not only the husband she believed she had, but also her dignity within that marriage. The silence that followed was heavy, fraught with an irreconcilable gulf between them. Natalie wept silently, while Jason, indifferent, acted as if he had provided a reasonable solution to the problem. She looked at him and wondered, how could someone who once promised to love her above all else ask her to kneel before the very person who destroyed her? There was no longer any doubt. Jason was not only negligent, he was complicit. By demanding an apology, He was siding with the aggressor, leaving Natalie completely alone on the battlefield. It was at that moment that Natalie realized the love she had for Jason had died. What remained was only a shell of a relationship, sustained by his convenience and cowardly silence. She knew she could no longer expect any defense from him, any gesture of genuine affection. That betrayal was the turning point. The marriage that had once seemed like a fairy tale now showed its cruelest face. It was a prison, and Jason was both the jailer and the accomplice of those who hurt her. Inside her, something began to change. Her wounded heart gave way to a hardened spirit, forged by pain. This final betrayal didn't just destroy Natalie's trust, it also shattered any illusion that she still needed that man to live. If before she fought for love, now she would fight for herself. If before she accepted silence and submission, now she awakened to her strength. Jason believed he had ended the argument by demanding an apology, but without realizing it, he had opened the door to his own downfall. Because in that moment, Natalie was no longer a victim, and deep in her heart, a promise echoed powerfully. She would no longer bow down. Revenge was already plotted. Natalie spent sleepless nights reliving every detail of the dinner, every cruel word, every gesture of her husband's inaction. The tears that had once been tears of pain began to transform into something else. Fuel. Within her, a flame arose, burning, impossible to extinguish. There was no longer room for illusions or vain hopes. The humiliation had destroyed the innocent and submissive wife within her. In its place, a determined woman emerged, ready to show that she would no longer be the victim of that family's wicked game. Revenge was not born of pure hatred, but of the need to regain her own dignity. That flame grew with each time Jason ignored her, and each time she remembered Frank's triumphant smile after he assaulted her. The fire in her soul told her it wasn't enough to simply walk away. No, she had to fight back. She had to return, with intelligence and precision, every wound inflicted upon her. Natalie knew she had no one to support her. Diane was complicit, Jason was complicit, and Frank was the tormentor. But she also knew that, alone, she could turn the tide. The pain that had once weakened her now made her indomitable. She began to change her posture. Instead of crying in secret, she began to observe in silence. Every gesture from Frank, every look from Jason, every misplaced word, everything became valuable information. Natalie understood that revenge isn't achieved through haste, but through patience. And patience was something she had learned to cultivate through years of contempt. Frank and Jason believed she was increasingly fragile, but they didn't realize they were only strengthening her resolve. With each provocation, the fire burned brighter within her, fueling the certainty that when the time was right, everyone would pay. Natalie also began to reflect on who she truly was. She realized she had spent years trying to please, seeking approval from people who would never value her. This realization was liberating. For the first time, she saw her life without the chains of fear and submission. The flame of revenge wasn't just about Frank or Jason. It was about herself. It was about proving she could rise up, that she could rewrite her own story. What had once been a dream of love now became a mission of justice. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would make her give up. Looking in the mirror, Natalie no longer saw a victim. She saw a woman reborn with steady eyes and a determination no one could erase. Suffering had broken her, but it had also rebuilt her into something much stronger. The flame of revenge was now her light, guiding her every step. And she knew it wouldn't be long before Frank and Jason would feel this fire burning through their own masks. They believed they had defeated her, but in truth, they had only given her her most powerful weapon: courage. Natalie knew revenge couldn't be carried out impulsively. If she truly wanted to expose Frank and Jason, she'd need more than courage. She'd need strategy. So she began to live in silence, hiding her true intentions behind a calm demeanor. She feigned resignation, allowing others to believe she was still fragile. While everyone thought she was accepting the role of submissive wife, Natalie planned every move. Her eyes, once brimming with tears, were now alert, recording details, every word, every slip. The silence that had previously suffocated her had become her greatest weapon. The first part of her plan was to gather evidence of Frank's true character. She began discreetly recording his humiliations. A recording here, a photo there, messages and emails that revealed his controlling behavior. Even snide comments during family gatherings were secretly recorded. Little by little, she built a robust archive, capable of shattering the perfect image he maintained before society. Frank, so secure in his position as patriarch, never imagined that his own daughter-in-law was setting a bomb ready to explode. But it wasn't just her father-in-law who would fall. Jason would also be part of the collapse. Natalie knew her husband was hiding financial secrets, investments made in his father's name, manipulations at work to maintain privileges. She began discreetly investigating, reviewing documents she found at home, accessing papers he left on the table. Each discovery was a piece of the puzzle that revealed not only Jason's submissiveness, but also his moral corruption. He wasn't just a silent accomplice. He was an active partner in his father's dirty games. As the plan took shape, Natalie also focused on strengthening her own position. She sought support from trusted people outside her family, lawyers and co-workers who admired her. Without fully revealing her intentions, she left clues that she was being wronged, creating a safety net. She knew that the day she decided to act, she would need allies to back up her version, to show the world that she was not the villain, but the victim who had stood up against years of oppression. Every conversation, every document saved, was another step toward the turning point. And so silently Natalie plotted her revenge. From the outside, she appeared to be just an indifferent wife, tolerating abuse and living under her father-in-law's orders. But inside, she was a ruthless strategist, calculating every detail, waiting for the right moment to strike. Frank and Jason didn't know it, but their downfall was already written, ready to happen, and when the time came, there would be no escape. The silent plan wasn't just about exposing secrets, but about turning the tables on everyone, transforming humiliation into triumph. New Year's Eve arrived in a setting that seemed to have been written by fate itself. Another family dinner, once again at Frank's house, in front of all those who had always silently witnessed Natalie's humiliations. But this time, the atmosphere was different. She didn't enter with her head bowed or her steps hesitant. He entered firmly, his gaze shining with confidence and something no one there had ever seen: power. Frank, seated in his chair like a king on a throne, barely noticed that the woman he thought fragile held in her hands the ruin of all his authority. As dinner progressed normally, Natalie remained calm, waiting for the right moment. And when Frank once again attempted a provocation disguised as a joke, she didn't back down. She stood up, holding a small device in her hands, and said firmly, "Enough." Silence fell over the room. The guests looked at each other in confusion. Then she pressed a button, and the room filled with Frank's voice recorded on various occasions, humiliating her, insulting her, belittling her own son, and confessing his financial manipulations. Every word echoed off the walls, every sentence revealing the true man behind the veneer of respect. The impact was immediate. The looks of admiration that had previously surrounded Frank turned to shock and revulsion. Diane, pale, couldn't look anyone in the eye. Jason desperately tried to turn off the device, but Natalie had already prepared. Copies of the recordings were being sent to the cell phones of a few trusted guests. There was no silencing the truth. For the first time, Frank was speechless. The man who had always dominated everyone with the power of his voice now trembled in silence, watching his reputation crumble before his very eyes. Jason tried to defend his father, but it was too late. Natalie, staring at him, also revealed the documents proving her involvement in illicit financial schemes alongside Frank. "You humiliated me, betrayed me, and tried to destroy me. But today, it's you who will be destroyed." The evidence was there, indisputable. Some relatives rose in indignation, others just watched in silence, but everyone understood. Power had shifted. The woman who had once been the target of ridicule was now the master of truth. The turnaround wasn't just an exposure. It was a spectacle of justice. Natalie didn't just break the silence, she weaponized it. Frank and Jason, who had always believed themselves untouchable, now faced their own downfall. The fear Natalie once carried into every dinner was etched on their faces. And the most painful thing for Jason was realizing that the woman he swore to control had become the force that unmasked him before everyone. Victory began there, before the eyes of all who had previously watched in silence. The room that had once been dominated by Frank's booming laughter was now plunged into a heavy, almost suffocating silence. The patriarch, who had always prided himself on his image as a powerful man, saw his reputation crushed before everyone's eyes. The recordings continued to echo in their minds, every insult, every manipulation, every threat revealed unfiltered. Frank tried to regain control, but the mask had slipped. The man who had thought himself indestructible now trembled, unable to maintain his composure. The fear, which for so long he had used as a weapon against everyone, was now turning against him. Jason, for his part, was pale. With each document revealed, each piece of evidence exposed, his role as an accomplice became more evident. The guests who had always admired him as the model son now saw him as a weak, submissive, and corrupt man. Natalie watched silently, with the serenity of someone who knew justice was being served. What had once seemed an unshakable empire began to crumble, stone by stone, before the astonished gaze of the entire family. For the first time, Frank and Jason were experiencing the bitter sensation of powerlessness. The consequences began to unfold quickly. Relatives withdrew in disgust. Longtime friends began to murmur among themselves, and some even left the house in protest. Frank's public image, built over decades, was irreversibly tarnished. It was only a matter of time before rumors spread throughout town, destroying his reputation as an honorable patriarch. Jason, who had always believed that living in his father's shadow was safe, now found himself dragged down with him. The fall wasn't just social, it was emotional, moral, and soon financial as well. Natalie didn't need to raise her voice. The simple fact that she had revealed the truth was enough to bring down those who had underestimated her. What had once been laughter and mockery was now silence and shame. Frank looked around desperately, searching for allies, but everyone looked away. Jason tried to justify himself, but no one listened. The family that so prized its perfect appearance was now unmasked, and the one who had caused this downfall wasn't an external enemy, but the woman they deemed weak. In that moment, Natalie felt something different. It wasn't just revenge, it was liberation. Seeing the power of the oppressors crumble before everyone's eyes brought a sense of justice that words couldn't describe. The empire of fear had come to an end, and the complicit silence that had reigned for so long was now transformed into voices of indignation against Frank and Jason. The fall was final, and there was no turning back. For the first time, Natalie breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that the truth had won. When the storm finally subsided that night, Natalie felt different. She was no longer the woman who had entered that house filled with fear, her shoulders hunched under the weight of humiliation. She was different, a reborn version of herself who had walked through the fire of pain and emerged stronger. Frank and Jason were defeated, not because she screamed louder or raised her hands, but because she had the courage to speak her truths. Natalie's victory wasn't just public, it was intimate. It was the release of years of silence, of hidden tears, of forced smiles. Finally, she had a voice. Finally, she had power. The following days were marked by the echo of these revelations. Frank's name spread throughout the town, no longer as the respected and controlling man, but as the unmasked oppressor. Jason, unable to cope with the shame, tried to reconnect with Natalie, begging for forgiveness, but she no longer saw him with the same heart. Their love had died the moment he demanded she apologize to her attacker. Now she saw only a small man who preferred to live in his father's shadow rather than become a true partner. And with this clarity, Natalie made the final decision. She would no longer stay in that marriage. Her separation was a symbolic act of victory. By freeing herself from Jason, Natalie not only walked away from a complicit husband, but also from the entire cycle of oppression that had tried to destroy her. She rebuilt her life with dignity, finding strength where before there had been only pain. She became an example to other women trapped in toxic relationships, showing that the strength to rise up can transform victims into victors. Her revenge was not only a settling of accounts, but a life lesson. Never underestimate the power of someone who has been hurt. Frank and Jason, on the other hand, reaped the fruits of their choices. They lost respect, allies, and the image they so valued. And the most painful thing for them was knowing that all of this came not from a powerful enemy, but from a woman they swore was too fragile to fight back. This was Natalie's true victory, proving that no oppressor can be overthrown by the courage of those who decide to stand up to her. Her silence turned into a scream, and the scream became freedom. And so, Natalie rose from the ashes of humiliation, stronger than ever. Her story is a reminder that revenge, when guided by truth, can also be justice, that no tear is wasted when used as fuel for overcoming, and that no one should accept living in the shadow of fear. If you also believe that justice always finds a way, subscribe to the channel and tell us what you thought of this story in the comments, because your voice matters too, and together we can give strength to those who need to hear that victory is possible. Natalie's story shows us that no matter how overwhelming the silence of pain may seem, There is always a moment when courage rises and transforms victims into victors. An oppressor's power lasts only until someone dares to expose the truth. And when that happens, every empire built on fear and manipulation crumbles in the face of a simple act of resistance. Natalie proved that dignity isn't something you ask for back. It's earned. She demonstrated that there is no greater strength than someone who decides to no longer accept humiliation and rise up to write their own story. Let this story serve as a reminder. Never underestimate those who have suffered, because it is precisely from pain that the greatest strengths are born. Justice often doesn't come through the paths we expect, but it always finds a way to blossom. Natalie's victory wasn't just hers, but for everyone who has felt the pain of injustice and dreamed of freedom. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced something similar, or know someone who has? Leave your opinion in the comments, it might inspire others. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to strengthen our community of stories of overcoming injustice. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder that no one is too weak to win when they decide to fight.